The afternoon light poured gently through the living room window, painting soft golden lines across the old wooden floor. Outside, the trees swayed lazily in the mild spring breeze, their shadows dancing on the walls like passing memories. Inside, everything was still, too still. Ethan sat by the window, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unfocused. The sound of a car engine faded into the distance, his father's car leaving behind a silence so complete that even the ticking clock seemed afraid to interrupt it. He didn't move for a long while. He simply watched the light shift, the dust motes drift, the shadows stretch across the room. There was a weight in his chest, familiar and quiet, like something that had been there for years, a kind of ache he didn't talk about anymore. From the outside, Ethan's life looked simple. He worked at the local library, lived in the same small house he grew up in, and greeted his neighbors with a polite smile every morning. But inside, his world was smaller, filled with memories he couldn't quite let go of, and words he'd never said aloud. His father had come by that afternoon, just as he always did once a week. They talked about routine things, whether repairs, bills, but never about feelings, never about the things that really mattered. When his father stood up to leave, Ethan had felt that familiar pull inside him, the urge to say something, anything to close the distance that had quietly grown between them since his mother passed away. But the words never came. They never did. Now the house was empty again, and the silence pressed against his thoughts. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled softly, as if trying to release the heaviness sitting inside him. There were days when he wondered if his father even noticed, how quiet their conversations had become, how much they both avoided the spaces where grief still lived. Ethan's eyes moved to the bookshelf across the room. Among the rows of worn paperbacks and old family photos sat a small wooden frame, a picture of his mother smiling on the porch, sunlight glinting in her hair. It had been years, and yet, every time he looked at that photo, the air seemed to still, as if the house remembered her too. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Soft, hesitant, he stood and crossed the room, surprised to find Emma standing there, his neighbor and his closest friend since childhood. She held a small box in her hands, her smile gentle but uncertain. "Hey," she said quietly, "your dad just drove off. I thought you might want some company." Ethan blinked, caught between surprise and relief. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said with a light shrug, stepping inside, "but I wanted to." Her presence brought a different kind of silence, not heavy, but calm, warm, almost comforting. She placed the box on the table and opened it to reveal 2 pieces of homemade pie. "Still your favorite?" she said with a small grin. He chuckled faintly. "You still remember?" "I remember everything," she said, her voice softening. They sat down, the sound of forks tapping plates the only thing breaking the quiet. Outside, a few leaves fluttered past the window, catching in the last rays of light. It was the kind of afternoon that felt endless and fragile all at once. Ethan glanced at her. There had been a time years ago when he and Emma used to talk about everything: school, dreams, plans for the future. But lately, even their conversations had grown cautious, as if they were both afraid of what might surface if they went too deep. "How's work been?" Emma asked after a moment. "Same as always," he said with a faint smile. "Quiet. You like quiet, though?" He looked down at his plate, thoughtful. Maybe too much sometimes. Something in his tone made her pause. She studied him, her brow softening. "Ethan, you've been different lately. Quieter than usual." He hesitated, unsure how to respond. How could he explain that his silence wasn't peace? It was protection. That every word he didn't say was another way to keep from breaking open. "I'm fine," he said instead. The old habit of deflection slipping out automatically, Emma nodded slowly, but didn't press. She simply sat with him, letting the quiet linger. Outside, the first hint of evening began to settle in, that soft blue hour where everything feels tender and half forgotten. Ethan glanced at her again. There was something about the way the fading light touched her face, the warmth in her eyes, the gentle steadiness she carried. It stirred something inside him, a longing he didn't have a name for. He looked away, feeling a quiet ache rise in his chest. He wanted to tell her about the distance between him and his father, about the loneliness that filled his nights, about how her presence was the only thing that made the house feel alive again. But the words stayed trapped behind the same invisible wall that had kept him silent for years. Instead, said softly, "Thanks for coming by." "Emma, I didn't realize how much I needed the company." She smiled, her eyes lingering on his. "You don't have to thank me. That's what friends are for." But as she said it, something flickered between them, unspoken, fragile, real. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. Somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt the smallest change, the sense that something long kept, hidden, might finally be ready to surface. And though he didn't know it yet, this quiet afternoon, the one that began with his father's departure, would become the turning point of everything he'd been afraid to say. The soft patter of rain began to fall outside, painting the window with streaks of silver. Inside, the living room grew dimmer, and the world seemed to slow down. Emma had stayed longer than she planned, not because of the weather, but because something about Ethan's silence felt different tonight. He wasn't lost in thought. He was remembering when she glanced at him. She saw it in his eyes, that faraway look, the kind that doesn't belong to the present. "Do you ever think about the old days?" she asked gently. Ethan smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Every day," he said. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window. It's strange how memories can sound louder than the present sometimes. Emma tilted her head, curious but patient. She knew that tone. It meant he was about to open up carefully, like someone unwrapping something fragile. Ethan's voice softened. "You remember the summer we built that treehouse behind your grandparents' field?" Her smile brightened. "Of course I do. You fell off the ladder 3 times." He laughed quietly. "And you stayed out there every day until I finally finished it. I never forgot that." The rain deepened its rhythm, filling the quiet between them. "That was the first time I realized," Ethan continued, "that some people don't just show up for the good parts. You were there even when everything went wrong." Emma looked down, her hands folded in her lap. "That's what friends do." "Maybe," he said softly, "but not everyone does." For a moment, the years between then and now seemed to fold in on themselves. Ethan could still see it, the golden light of that summer afternoon, the warmth of laughter echoing across the field, the feeling of belonging to a world that was simple and whole. But the memory didn't stop there. It shifted gently to another moment years later, when everything began to change. He remembered standing by the gate one winter morning, watching Emma load boxes into her father's truck. She was leaving for college, full of dreams and plans. He had wanted to say something, not to stop her, but to tell her how much her friendship meant, how much light she had brought into his quiet world. But just like with his father, the words never came. Instead, he'd smiled, told her he was proud, and waved as the truck disappeared down the road. He remembered the snow falling after that, soft and endless, covering the street in white silence. He hadn't realized it then, but that was the day his world grew quieter now. Sitting across from her all these years later, he wondered if she remembered it the same way, the bittersweet beginning of a distance neither of them meant to create. Emma broke the silence first. "I used to think about that treehouse when I was away," she said. "Whenever things felt too big or confusing, I'd picture it. The smell of the wood, the sound of the wind in the branches. It always made me feel safe." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You did?" She nodded. "I missed home more than I thought I would, and you were part of that." Something inside him shifted, a quiet realization that maybe all this time their memories had been reaching for each other, even across the years. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle. The world felt wrapped in stillness again, the kind that held stories too tender to rush through. Ethan spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "After Mom passed, I tried to fill the silence with routine, work, errands, anything. But it never really helped. Everything just echoed. Emma's gaze softened. Echoed. He nodded slowly. Yeah, like every room in this house remembered her voice, and every sound after that was just an imitation. She looked around at the pictures, the small details that carried traces of a life once full. It must have been hard, she said gently. He met her eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. It was, but you showing up back then, even when you didn't say much, helped more than you know. A faint smile touched her lips. You were always the one who never asked for help. I just wanted you to know someone was still there. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer empty, it was full, threaded with memories, regrets, and something unspoken that had quietly survived the passing years. Ethan took a slow breath. I think I spent so long trying not to feel lonely that I forgot how to feel anything at all. Until tonight. Emma's heart tightened. She wanted to say something to reassure him, but the look in his eyes, open, honest, fragile, was enough. She reached out, her hand resting gently on the table between them. No words followed. Just a shared stillness, one that seemed to bridge, not only the space between them, but the years that had quietly drifted by. Outside, the last drops of rain clung to the window pane before sliding away, leaving behind a clear reflection of the two of them sitting together in the dim light, not as they once were, but as they were now, older, quieter, and somehow closer than they'd been in years. And somewhere in that stillness, Ethan understood that the past hadn't disappeared. It had only been waiting, patient and persistent, for the right moment to be remembered. The next morning arrived with a hush of light spilling through thin curtains. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed, clean, and sweet. Drops of water still clung to the porch railing. Glittering like tiny pieces of glass, Ethan stood by the window, watching the quiet street below. Everything looked the same, the tall oak at the corner, the neighbors' mailboxes, the empty driveway, and yet something felt different. Maybe it was the conversation from the night before. Maybe it was Emma. He hadn't expected her to stay so long. He hadn't expected her to listen the way she did, patiently, as if every word he'd finally spoken had a place to land. For years, he'd carried that silence like a secret. But last night, for the first time, didn't feel so heavy. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the faint steam rising in the morning light. He could still see the faint trace of her smile when she left, gentle, understanding, as if she knew what he hadn't yet said. And now, as he looked out at the empty street, he found himself hoping, without even meaning to, that she might come by again later that day. The small town seemed to come alive again after the rain. The cafe on Main Street buzzed with soft chatter and the scent of fresh bread. Ethan had gone there to pick up a few things for work, but when he stepped inside, he saw her sitting by the window, her notebook open. Her expression thoughtful. For a moment, he froze. It had been years since he'd seen her in that kind of light. Focused, calm, a little lost in thought. The same Emma he'd known, yet somehow different. She looked up then, her eyes catching his. A spark of recognition passed between them, not sharp but warm. Like the quiet return of something long missing. "Ethan," she said, smiling softly, "I was hoping I might run into you." He chuckled, a little surprised. "You were." She nodded, closing her notebook. "I realize we never finished our conversation." He raised a brow. "The one from last night. The one that's been waiting for years," she replied gently. He hesitated before sitting across from her. The sound of rainwater dripping from the awning outside filled the space between their words. "I didn't mean to say so much," he admitted. "It just came out." "Glad it did," she said simply. "You've kept too much inside for too long." Ethan looked down, a small smile touching his lips. "You always had a way of knowing that." Emma laughed softly, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "Maybe I just paid attention." Her tone wasn't teasing. It was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of voice that made a person feel seen. They sat there for a while, talking about small things, her new job at the local paper, the renovations she was helping her parents with, the book Ethan had been reading. The conversation felt natural, easy, Every pause was comfortable, every silence full of meaning rather than absence. When she glanced at him again, her eyes softened. "You seem lighter today." He nodded. "I feel lighter. Maybe it's because I finally said what I should have said years ago." "What's that?" She asked. "That I was lonely," he said quietly, "and that I missed having someone who really understood me." Emma's expression didn't change right away. She just looked at him, not surprised, not uncertain, just deeply present. Then she smiled. "You're not the only one who felt that way." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a glow across the cafe's wooden tables. Ethan could feel the old ache in his chest softening, not disappearing, but turning into something gentler, something like peace. He took a sip of his coffee, then asked, "Do you ever wonder why we drifted apart?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe it wasn't really drifting. Maybe it was just life pulling us into different chapters. And now, she smiled faintly, maybe we're just finding our way back into the same one. The simplicity of her words struck him more than he expected. It wasn't a promise, not even a confession, just an acknowledgement of something real. A quiet truth shared between two people who had finally stopped running from their own hearts. A sudden breeze pushed through the cafe door, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth. Emma brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes glancing toward the window. "Do you want to take a walk?" she asked. "It feels like one of those days that shouldn't be wasted indoors." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I'd like that." They left the cafe and stepped into the golden light of afternoon. The town glistened from the rain, every puddle reflecting the soft blue of the clearing sky. They walked side by side down the familiar road, the one that led past their old school, the park where they used to talk for hours. The quiet turns where childhood had slowly turned into something more complicated. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The rhythm of their steps said everything, the slow rediscovery of comfort, of connection, of something that never really ended. As they reached the old wooden bridge at the edge of town, Ethan stopped, his gaze drifting to the rippling water below. "Funny," he said, his voice low, "how some places never change." Emma looked at him, her eyes soft with recognition. "Maybe they change with us. Maybe that's the beauty of it." He turned to her then, the sunlight catching the faint smile on her face. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to hide behind silence. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the hum of life, the scent of rain, and the warmth of someone who had once known him best, Ethan realized that the past hadn't come back to haunt him. It had come back to heal him. The late afternoon light stretched softly across the sky, turning the river beneath the bridge into liquid gold. Ethan and Emma stood side by side, watching the gentle ripples move downstream. The air was cool, touched by the faint scent of pine and earth after rain. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was calm now, not empty, not heavy, just real. The kind of quiet that only happens when words have run out, and only truth remains. Ethan leaned against the wooden railing, his eyes following a small leaf as it drifted down the water's path. "You know," he began slowly, "I used to come here a lot, especially after my mom passed. I'd stand in this exact spot and tell myself that if I stayed still long enough, maybe the world would stop changing." Emma's gaze softened. "Did it help?" He smiled faintly. "No, but it gave me a place to breathe." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes that's all we need." The sun dipped lower, painting the clouds in shades of peach and lavender. A small breeze lifted the edge of Emma's hair, brushing it across her face. Ethan wanted to reach out, not to hold, not to keep, just to remind himself that she was really here. But instead, he kept his hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Emma murmured, "about feeling lonely even when people are around." Ethan glanced at her, quietly surprised. She continued, "I think we all have that feeling sometimes. The space between who we are and who we wish we could be with someone." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I've lived in that space for a long time." The soft hum of distant traffic faded as the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Two people standing on an old bridge, holding years of unspoken words. Ethan took a slow breath. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Emma, there's something I should have told you a long time ago. Back when we were younger, before life got so busy, and before I learned how to stay silent." She turned toward him, her expression gentle but attentive. "I always admired you," he said quietly. "Not just because you were kind or smart, but because you saw people, really saw them. Even me, when I didn't want to be seen. And I think that's what scared me." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You reminded me of everything I was afraid to feel. Joy, loss, love, all of it. I thought if I kept my distance, I could protect myself. But all I did was build a wall that kept out the very things that made life worth living." Emma's eyes shimmered softly in the light. "Ethan." He shook his head gently, a small smile forming. "I'm not saying this because I expect anything. I just don't want to keep it locked away anymore. You were a part of my story long before I understood what that meant, and I'll always be grateful for that." For a moment, the wind carried nothing but the sound of the river below. Then Emma stepped closer, her voice warm but calm. "Do you want to know the truth?" she asked. He nodded. "I used to wait for you to say something, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to know if what I felt wasn't just my imagination. Every time I came home, every time I passed this bridge, I wondered if we'd ever talk the way we used to. I thought maybe we'd missed our chance." Ethan's breath caught, the words sinking into him with both weight and relief. "But maybe," she continued, "we didn't miss anything. Maybe we just needed time to understand who we are separately before we could really see each other again." He smiled then, quietly, genuinely. "You always find the right way to say things." She laughed softly. "No, I just stopped trying to say the perfect thing. I think honesty sounds better when it's simple." The sun had nearly disappeared now, leaving behind a soft twilight glow. The air cooled and a few fireflies flickered near the trees. They walked slowly back toward the town, the gravel crunching under their steps. The world felt lighter, not because everything was solved or promised, but because the truth had finally been spoken. When they reached the crossroads near their old neighborhood, Ethan stopped. "Emma," he said quietly, "I don't know what happens next, but I don't want to disappear again." She looked at him, her expression warm and full of understanding. "Then don't. Sometimes all it takes is showing up." He nodded. "I can do that." They shared a smile, small, sincere, the kind that carried years of understanding behind it. No dramatic endings, no grand gestures. Just two people standing beneath the fading light, choosing honesty over distance. As Emma turned to leave, she looked back one last time. "Ethan," she said softly, "you don't have to fix the past. You just have to keep walking forward." He watched her go, the evening breeze moving gently through the trees. When she disappeared around the corner, he closed his eyes and let the quiet settle in, not the lonely kind he once feared, but the peaceful kind that comes when the heart finally makes room for something new. And for the first time in years, Ethan smiled to himself, a calm, genuine smile that came from knowing that even after loss, even after distance, connection has a way of finding its way home. Asterisk, asterisk, because sometimes the truth isn't about changing the past, it's about finally being free to live the present. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.